Okay, good morning. So we actually began learning in Hemshech Tzadik Dalet again on page 112, which corresponds with Ayin Beis, volume 2, page 1151. So we're going over a theme that we've discussed, but now with the Frierdiker Rebbe's take on it and additions. As I said, most of it is actually almost word for word from Ayin Beis, with some here and there, some additions. Not quite as it was earlier, where the Frierdiker Rebbe added a lot. Okay, so middle of page 112, Tzadik Dal. If you need the text, go to ayinbeis.com and you have all the PDF text there. Okay. So what did we learn? And it's like for the second time we're learning this, that the meaning of ayin, though it's a general word called ayin, one second. Though the general word ayin identifies that interface, that channel we've been calling, that interfaces between the Yesh Amiti and the Yesh Nivra, the absolute true reality of God, of Atzmus, and the created reality of the Yesh. So there's a general word, we called it Ayin. But indeed, the two levels of Ayin, that Ayin divides into two, has a very different meaning when you talk about from the perspective of the Mashpia. Who's the Mashpia here? Mimcha HaKel. The Yesh Amiti, everything originates from the Mashpia. So there's one perspective and definition of Ayin, and then there's a different definition of Ayin when you talk from the perspective below of the Yesh HaNivra looking at the Ayin above it. So the Yesh Amiti looks at the Ayin below it, the Yesh HaNivra looks at the Ayin above it, and they have different meanings. So that's what we began learning. So the last thing we learned was that from the Mashpia's point of view, which will later be called Das Elyon, the perspective from above, everything is rooted and originates from him. And what is the Pirush of Ayin? Compare Gabi Yesh Amiti, Pirushe Ayin Mamish. We say Ayin, nothingness, literally nothingness. But not nothingness as if nothing exists, nothing as in value. It doesn't have any value of its own. He says that explicitly. She'enet tefes mokum klal. It doesn't have any significant or value. Shagam etzema even etzema enet tefes mokum klal kal gaba atzmus, because it's and not atzmi. I'm just reviewing what we said. It's and not the core essence. Hari hurak ha'or levad. It's only a reflection. She'enet mahuz dover la'atzmei. A reflection is not any personality or identity of its own. What is a reflection? A reflection, even of the reflection of the sunlight, doesn't have any substance of its own. It's reflecting its source. It's emanating its source. When you say, for example, a yesh, even yesh miyesh has substance. Something exists, and from that you take, and let's say you shape a raw piece of clay into a pot. These all have substance. You can't call them ayin mamish. They have substance. But compared to the ayin, to the yesh amiti, all of this has no substance and no value, because it has nothing that a mahus level is asking. Everything originates from the source, and therefore its existence is called ayin. Shagam etzmer ene tefes mokum klal gabas. This is right. The ene tefes mokum klal. That word ene mahus dover la'atzmei. It's an interesting addition. I want to see if the Rebbe Rashab says those words. Just a second. It's interesting. The Rebbe Rashab says, "She'ene muhus dover be'atzmei." The Frierdiker Rebbe says, "She'ene muhus dover le'atzmei." Probably means the same thing. Just pointing out that distinction. Just wanted to see what he used. So I'll just add a few more points to this. Number one, being that the Atzmus is completely a self-contained truth. His existence comes from within himself. He is built in Mitzias Nimtza, non-existential existence. So essentially nothing has any significance and value when you're talking about a level like that. As soon as you talk about a Mitzias Nimtza, something that exists, so all other Mitzias Nimtzayim, all other existence, it may be very distant from it, it may be infinitely apart, but they all carry one thing, they all exist. But what do you say about something that you can't even call existence? You can't call it that it exists like we exist. So basically our whole existence is, yes, he's capable of creating it. That's not what we're discussing now. We're discussing it as, is there any comparison? Can you even say it's infinitely apart? You can't even say infinitely apart, as I explained. Another thing, which I think he's hinting to, is what we learned a lot earlier, that a Metzias that is dependent on a creator is never a true existence. Because at the end of the day, it didn't have to be. It didn't have to exist. So it has no real value of its own. When it came to Ruchnius, we learned that once it exists, it has a kiyum mitzad atzmei because it has some inherent value because it reflects its creator. So bittul has that value. So Ruchnius, we called kiyum mitzad atzmei, it had what we call inherent significance on its own, not on its own, because it's the type of creation it is one that reveals its source. So that gives it a certain inherent value. But its mitzias, its existence, doesn't have to be. If something doesn't have to be, even if it exists, it's a you call it negligible. It's what he calls here eina muhuz davar la'atzmei or be'atzmei. So I think there's a few points here. We discuss it to really make the point clear. Bottom line is that you can use the word ayin. That compared to atzmus, compared to yesh amiti, everything's ayin mamish, even the highest levels of oir. Okay. And now he goes to the next section here, which of course is, again, almost word for word from Ayin Beis, about shinui. Now he's going to talk about, and we discussed this at length in Ayin Beis. I'm not going to go over it again in detailed explanation. Again, it's all recorded, and you could always refer to this on page 1151, middle of 1151, where he talks about now this next section. What does he say? So he says like this. And that's why I, God, do not change. So now you see the extent of how removed he is from it all. There's no shinui, no change from before and after the creation. That's the words from Ayin Beis. What does that mean? It seems bizarre. It seems yifla, wondrous, strange. Weren't the emanations emanated? The nivra nivraim and the creations created? They're not talking about a dimion. This is not an illusion. They actually were created. Actually, it's not even relevant if it's an illusion or not. Did something happen? When we say that there's Atzilus and there's Bria Yitzir Asiya, that there's an existence that was emanated or created, is that a statement or not? God created heaven and earth. So how could you make a statement that there's no change from before creation and after creation, as if it doesn't make a difference? So the explanation is, everything that emanated and came into being, it's all coming from the ha'ara, only the reflection itself. That's where, in that space, so to speak, in that field of energy, is where all existence occupies. So, number one, existence is not within Atzmus, so to speak. Obviously, Atzmus is everywhere. But there's a very big difference between a Metzias Nimtza being everywhere, like when you say Erein Sof Mamala Kol HaMetzias, before the Tzimtzum. There you're saying there's a presence of divine consciousness that does not leave room for existence. You don't say that on Atzmos, because Atzmos, you can't call it presence. Therefore, you can't, it's not a contradiction to existence, and you don't, and a Tzimtzum wouldn't make a difference, because revelation and concealment does not affect Atzmos. So why then did God make it? Because for us to exist and us to make sense of it, if it was only Atzmos and us, we would have no bridge and interface, as I've explained so many times. So so interestingly, the air that does not allow room for existence is actually lower than Atzmos, because Atzmos does let room for existence. But it would be Kol Yochel, because God can do anything. So Erein Sof is a Metzias Nimtza. It's like saying, just as an example, I was going to give a good example. The example would be, okay, a brilliant teacher and a student. So if the brilliant teacher is expounding and fully expressing and revealing his brilliance, there's no room for a student to be there. First of all, it's overwhelming. Second of all, the student is completely overshadowed. There's only one presence there. But if the teacher was silent, the student could be sitting near the teacher, because the consciousness of the teacher is not dominating. The presence of the teacher does not contradict another entity. Just as an example. So Seichel, the revelation of Seichel, can overshadow another revelation of Seichel. But an Etzem is not concealed and does not contradict anything, because it can do whatever it wants, and it's not a contradiction to another presence. So you're talking about Atzmos, you don't have this whole issue of how did it come into creation. The only question would be if when they're talking about Ur. So that's one key point. The second thing is that this explains what existence consists of, that God first created a field of energy. I'm using that word deliberately. Erein Sof. And all that is a ha'ara compared to Atzmos. And that's where existence plays itself out. Remember, I gave the example just to envision a bit. If you think of existence as an island amidst a very large, infinite sea of water. So that island consists of a few things. Its existence in the place of the Cholul Mokum Panei that the Tzimtzum created, but even the water around the island is also part of existence. It's just a part of existence that has to be concealed for the island to emerge. So time and space as we know it is that island. Lifnei Tzimtzum is the full expanse of the field of energy, and Atzmos can be defined not by island and not by a sea, not by a field of energy, and not by any particle within that field of energy. Because Atzmos is not defined by space and time in any way, even conceptual, and not defined by its presence even. So when you say existence, that's why Leishanisi. Because not that he didn't create, of course he created existence. He's the one that emanated the light. He's the one that in the light chose to create Atzilus, Netzolo and Atzalim, like he says, Nivra Nivraim. But it's not in the Atzmos type of existence that all this matters. It matters only in an existential state, not in a non-existential state, basically put. Okay. So therefore, so the ha'ara does not take for smokum the gaba ha'atzmus. That's why in truth there's no shinui. Nothing changed. Atzmus did not become bigger due to the fact that existence came into being, and doesn't become smaller. Nothing changed. And again, this when talking about in the creation process, the question with avoida touches Atzmus, and Atzmus wants to be so-called reach nechayach nachas ruach lefanai shamarti v'nasir etzeni, We talked about that. That's another discussion, not relevant directly here. Because first of all, that's all what God wants. It's not because God needs. He wants it. And even as he wants it, we said he's not nitfus in it. He's not defined by it. The fact that he wants it, yes, Atzmus in his own mysterious way wants to have a relationship with us, whatever that means. However you explain it or don't explain it. But relationship by definition is with levels of oyer. Like in other words, can the built Metzias Nimtza marry a Metzias Nimtza? Mitzad Kol Yochel, anything is possible. We can't fully understand it, but we know this, that through our Avodah, which is also, remember, if you really go deeper, the fact that built Metzias Nimtza created Metzias Nimtza means that the Metzias Nimtza has some relationship with built Metzias Nimtza, even though they don't, it's completely ayin and makes no change. But the fact of the matter is, built Metzias Nimtza put this into place. So somewhere is embedded so-called a ability for us to reach upward. And through bittul, we could enter into places that you can't reach through direct contact. Okay. You want to ask something?
I just said that the oil, the Metzias Nimtza, has some meaning by the building Metzias Nimtza, mitzad nisave b'tachtenim. That's the only way.
But nisave does not mean meaning. Nisave means desire. Who says it means meaning?
No meaning. But the tfisas mokoim of the oil by the built-in Metzias Nimtza, because that's the way to reach the...
No, where'd you get that? He says, ain't a teifas mokim klal. Where'd you get that this teifas mokim?
No, not that. You said a minute ago that the oil, there is some kind of connection with the built-in Metzias Nimtza.
I said that God wanted, and his wish is that through our Aveda, we can make contact in some way. And I said it's not relevant here because that's not what he's discussing. Here he's talking about the creation process, not the Aveda process. Okay. I'm obviously not going to contradict what it says here. He makes it very clear it's not Teifas Mokim at all. I was just qualifying. So then what is Aveda? So Aveda is because God wants that a mitzvah and our Aveda, this is the Nesava. But Nesava doesn't mean that he gets fulfilled. It doesn't mean he's changed by it, because he's not nitzvahs by it. He's not defined by it. Even Nesava does not mean he is affected or changed by it. That's very clear. So what is Nesava? Kasha. It's a mystery, to be honest, because it's not in the world of Seichel. Remember, Seichel is part of Metzias Nimtza. Metzias Nimtza is completely not Teifas Mokim L'gaba Metzias Nimtza. So how could Seichel tell us anything about a Metzias built to Metzias Nimtza? And yet, yes, I did say it all comes from there, because that's what God desired. So in some way, when we, through our Aveda, we can some way connect. That doesn't mean we become Atzmus. It means we connect, and we have, in our words, in our language, Dibra Teira B'Lashon B'nei Adam, you can say relationship. But when you say a marriage, like you're talking about definitely in the world of Giluyim and Metzias Nimtza. But let's continue. Okay. So like we say, Atu Kaidem Shenivrei Olam, you are the one that was before, prior to creation. And you're the one that was after creation. Completely equanimous, completely equal, before and after. Now, when you say that expression, you don't have to interpret it that way. You could interpret that you, God, were here before existence and you're here after existence. But Chassidus teaches no. The Ata that was before is the same Ata as you are after. Not just that you exist before and after, but that is the same without a change. As if existence did not make any difference, because all of existence is taking place in the field of energy called Ha'ara Oyer. So now going back to the Pirush of Ayin. So what does Ayin mean from the perspective of Atzmos? Uvim Kain. So this is the case. Based on this, Pirush Ayin Hu Sha'er V'Agili Min Ha'atzmos U'B'chinas Ayin Mamish. So the meaning of ayin, from the perspective of the yesh amiti, the ayin amiti, is that the ayin, the oir and the gili from atzmus, the light and energy and revelation from atzmus, hu b'chinas ayin mamish. It's completely mamish, like nothing, as if nothing happened. Legabe ha'atzmus, in comparison, or from the perspective of atzmus. I just want to give an example to help a little in Aveda. In volume 1, you may recall, closer to the end, around 2/3 through the volume 1, we learned about the difference between two levels of Reimamus. Reimamus is to be exalted, grandeur, Malchus Dekait, Reimamus. So when you say someone has Reimamus, they're like Merumam, they're lifted up and beyond. You say about a melech. From his shechem, from his shoulders and up. He's like stands above the rest.
Shaul HaMelech. Shaul HaMelech.
Yeah, but this expression is used on a king, and it doesn't just mean physically taller. He means his stature is completely. So he explained there's two levels of that. One in Klippe and one in Gedusha. He gave the example from a Klippe from Haman. So Haman convinced Achashverosh that he should be worshipped. Everybody should bow to him. Respect him as a person of stature. Mordechai, of course, la yicher v'la yishtachve, as the Megillah tells us. So this is a reimamus, but it's a reimamus of Klippe, that the only way that you really have a sense of esteem is because others bow to you. It's not reimamus atzmi, as he called it there. It's not reimamus atzmi, because you need that. You need that recognition. In other words, you consider yourself higher, but you're not higher be'etzem. You need to demonstrate. It's like someone who has to force other people to respect them. Reimus atzmi does not need anybody's respect. We respect it on our own, but it's fundamentally above. And that's why a merumam be'etzem can be sitting with very lowly people. As a matter of fact, he brings it as dachka v'shpal ruach, that reimus atzmi actually is drawn to people who are impoverished or lowly or what's the word? People who are of life has broken them, you can say. You know, the poor, because it's not a contradiction. So to use an expression from the Tzemach Tzedek, once they were sitting at the Seder, and there was a guest there, and it came to Yachatz, when we break the matzah, right? A larger part and a smaller part. And then we take the larger part and break it into 5, Hey Gvuras, Afikamen. So there was a guest there, he broke the matzah and he started measuring which is the bigger part. Because he didn't break it exactly 2/3 and 1/3, he broke it. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, a godel, was medafem mesten, is ken godel nicht. A large godel here is something, a great person who you have to measure is not really a godel, because the mere fact that you're measuring is already tell you, okay, you're bigger than another one, but you're not really fundamentally bigger. So Remus be'etzem is nothing is a contradiction. It doesn't need, it's not measured by others, and it doesn't get stronger because somebody respects it, because it's fundamentally be'etzem has that deep, profound, essential self-esteem. So what I'm saying is, in context of here, that when you talk about atzmus, atzmus is merumim be'etzem, and even beyond that, to be honest, even that you can't say. But as an example, whereas Ein Sof is take merumam, and in its presence you can't have existence, that's why you need a tzimtzum. But the mere fact that you need a tzimtzum means they can't coexist. Someone that is truly fundamentally an atzmi can coexist with anyone. There's nothing contradicts because you're not in the same league altogether. So the mere fact that you say, for example, that water and land cannot live side by side means that they affect each other. The Alter Rebbe brings in Shaykh Damun example that when you say Chachma I efshel l'masha shabiyadayim, you can't touch wisdom, intelligence, and anyone that says that, it's a joke. It's not even in the same league. To say, for example, you can't touch your soul. No, that's not a good example. That you can't touch a subatomic particle. Okay, because it's so minuscule. But to say that touch and intelligence are not in the same league. Intelligence is completely of a different personality. So there are things that are in the same world, and one is larger than the other or greater than the other. And then there are things that are completely from a different dimension, and it makes no difference. That whether, a person who is of that level, whether you're having a simple person sitting near him, or the greatest Talmud Chacham is Bashva Gemura, like he says here, it's equal. Not because of arrogance, but because he's made of a completely different caliber. Just as an example, it's not a perfect example, because it's all a Mitzias Nimtza, but it's an example to show levels of beyond, so to speak. Okay. One more, okay, so the ayin therefore, from the point of view of Atzmus, Gaba Atzmus is ayin mamish, she'ena tefes mokem klal. He repeats that several times. It does not occupy any value, any conceptual value, any space. When I say space here, we mean tefes mokem value, significance. Now he goes to the second ayin. So that's the interpretation of ayin from the perspective from above. How about ayin from the perspective from below, from the yesh hanivra? So he says, now by contrast, the level of the ayin, that's a source for the recipients, means the mokir for the makablim, for the creation. The ayin of the yesh hanivra, the yesh nivra, the ayin of the created yesh, the created existence. That which we call it ayin, you say yesh ma'ayin, that this created yesh came from ayin. The fact that we call it ayin in legabe hayesh, from the perspective or in comparison, in contrast to the yesh, that's not due because the ayin doesn't carry any value and significance, like in the first interpretation of ayin. Because that statement that an ayin doesn't have any significance and value, you can only say compared to atzmus, because atzmus is of a completely different reality. You can't say that on a yesh hanivra, that the ayin is not teifus mokim, like it has, as if nothing happened. But not atzmus, but comparison to the yesh misava or the gabi from the perspective of the Yesh HaMisaveh, you can't say that the ayin that creates the Yesh, the created Yesh, doesn't have any, has no standing. That's a good word also, tfisas mokim, no standing. Shari memenu is savuse, because the Yesh, the ayin, from the ayin came its creation. The whole Yesh came from the ayin. So how could the ayin say, I'm sorry, how could the yesh say the ayin has no standing? So we have to look for a different meaning in the word ayin. V'nikra ayin shel hayesh. It's called the ayin of this yesh. Hainu shu mokir hamahav es hayesh, which means it's the source that brought the yesh into being, that created the yesh. So then what does ayin mean then? If you can't use the first interpretation that we used on Atzmus, so what does it mean? Omnom, zeh, mashu nikre b'shem ayin. However, here, this what we call it ayin, l'gaba hayesh, in contrast or in comparison or from the perspective of the yesh, hu mebeis taimim, for two reasons. So here he specifically says two reasons. The Frieder Rebbe Rashab didn't he said a reason and another reason, but the Frierdiker Rebbe actually spells out two reasons. So we have the number 2 spelled out. Ha'echad, the first reason, the reason it's called ayin is because it's not in a state of davar mitzias, of substance and matter and qualities and ingredients. I mean, these are all good words to use. The way it is, the mitzias of the yesh. So it's not two entities where you could say, okay, they have some similar ingredients or similar personality. No. From the yesh is a very defined personality, what we call a yesh. The ayin that creates it is not made of the same matter. So you could call it, it's not the b'chinas davar mitzias like the yesh is davar mitzias. So for example, if someone said to you, where is your soul? What does it look like? The answer would be, you're mistaken in your question. The soul is not defined by the same instruments, how we measure and define the body. The physical world, we define through our 5 senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. Other empirical evidence. When it comes to the ayin, all that doesn't apply. So it's called ayin not because it doesn't have any significance or value, like in the first interpretation of ayin from the perspective of atzmus. Here ayin means because it's not of the yesh, it's not of the material of the yesh. So it's called lei davar. He calls it lei b'chinas davar mitzias kamaya yesh shu b'mitzias mamish. V'hainu. This means that mokar amahavu b'chinas lei davar. That the source, the creator, the creative energy, the creative force, the ayin, is a b'chinas lei davar. It's not an object. Now we have to qualify. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It's not an object as what the world of yesh, defines as an object. This is still all the first reason. The Ayin Beis is going to be 4 lines from the bottom. So he's continuing and explaining this now. So there's 2 reasons, again, why it's called ayin. We're talking about the ayin of the yesh hanivra. Now he continues and says like this. Omnom. He qualifies. Now, however, the fact that we call it lei davar, even in this state, that it's called ayin, it doesn't mean lei davar klal, that doesn't exist at all. He's saying it's lei davar. It's not an object like the Mitzias Yesh defines as an object. Sharihu be'erech hayesh. Because it's commensurate and relates to the yesh. Yes, it's of a different reality, a different substance, different ingredients, if you wish. But it's still be'erech hayesh, because it's the ayin that is manifesting in and creating and energizing the yesh. Liyez b'chinas mokarei lov, being that it's in a state of being a source for the yesh. Yesh ma'ayin. The source, however, is not yesh miyesh, of the same substance. The source is from they call it a spiritual divine substance, energy. But you can't call it lei davar as if it's non-existent, like lei tfisus makim. It does exist. It just doesn't exist in the same fashion. It's not made of the same material. Vim kain, and since there's that erech relationship, hari behechach shu b'chinas davar ma. So you have to say that there's something there. It's just not the yesh, but it's something there. When you talk about the ayin amiti, from the perspective of atzmus, we said, doesn't have any standing. But even from a perspective of existence, the ayin amiti is so beyond us because it's not manifesting in existence. So the ayin amiti, however you interpret it in all 3 interpretations, whether it's lifnei tzimtzum, the etzem ha'er, whether it's sevav kalalman, whether it is the pnimius or the higher level of the kav, or the pnimius and the etzem of the eir of mamala kalalman. That's completely beyond existence. And then there's the ayin of the yesh hanivra that relates to existence, as we learned at length. But the ayin of the yesh hanivra, its whole purpose is to get closer to and relate and manifest and enclose itself in existence. So you can't call it something ein davar completely. So you have to say something is there, davar ma, something is there. So for example, when we say yehi oir, the oir that exists comes from the yehi oir of the divine utterance, statement. So yes, it's loy davar, it's not made of the same substance as a physical reality, but to say that it doesn't have any relationship, it absolutely does. Ayin amiti doesn't have asar mamaris, it doesn't have yehi oir or yehi rakia. So you have to say there's bechinas davar ma. At sheshayich lemer alav shu moker. To the point that you can apply to it and call it a source. Okay, now comes the qualification. If you remember, Ayin Beis, all this is Ayin Beis. Okay, but on the other hand, we know creation also comes from a place that's beyond us. The power of creation is only in the highest levels. She's going to qualify and explain that the relationship of the ayin to the yesh has two dimensions. One is completely beyond, or I should say the creative force. One is completely beyond and from richuk, and one is kiruv. We discussed the difference between the power of creation and the process of creation. So here he goes. And even though we know that creation is ein arech, to create something is not a gradual, progressive gradation from level to level. It's ein arech, it's a leap. As much as ruchnius, spirituality will be diminished, even to the point of yehi oir. It doesn't, spirituality does not create physicality. You need some other force that's beyond spirit and matter, like he's going to say. Because isn't it the fact that the creation of the yesh cannot be in a close way where one level is close to the other, relatively to each other? It's richuk erech, because you're talking about a creation. You're not talking about yesh mi-yesh. You're talking about yesh ma'ayin. So you're creating something that didn't exist before. So where does that come from? That has to come from something that's beyond it all. Again, all this we learned inside, so just reviewing. This is what we say, that the Nevraim themselves, the creations themselves, machlichim, they compel sha'amakir hu ayin, that the makir is a state of ayin. Because when we see a mitzias yesh, the existence of something of substance, you have to say that its creation came from a state that is not similar to the state of the yesh. So I think what we explained, because when you read this initially, it sounds like, 1 second, you just said that the ayin is in kiruv. Now you're saying the ayin is richuk. So he's going to explain both are correct. In other words, on one hand, the fact that something exists tells you that what put it here cannot be of the same nature of the thing that exists, because ein davar eses atzmei, nothing can create itself. So to say one creation created another creation doesn't make sense, because they both need to have a creator. So the mere fact that there's a yesh tells you there's something outside of the world of yesh that put it here. But as he's going to explain, there's two elements to it. One is it tells us that there's a mystery, something that's beyond that created it. At the same time, like he's going to qualify, nevertheless, the process of how the creation happens is the creative energy enters into the creation. It could have been only richuk. God says, I want creation, and there's no asara ma'amaris, there's no 10 statements, and there's no relationship between the yesh and ayin. So that's what he's going to qualify. So it's all in the form of coming from a creative richuk erech. However, Mikol Mokim. Nevertheless, Hinegam Zeh Muchach Lemer. Just like it compels us to say that the yesh compels that there's something outside of the yesh that put it there, it also compels us to say she'ena b'chinas ayin legamri, that the creative energy that enters and creates existence is not complete ayin, completely beyond. The ma'achar shu mokel yesh halei behechrach shu b'chinas shaychus u b'chinas erech halayesh. Being that it becomes a moker, meaning that it is identifiable as a source, like when you say, where did light come from? You hear Where did rakia come from? You hear rakia. Where did water come from? Chesed of Atzilus. Where did fire come from? Gvur of Atzilus. And so on. So all these, so on one hand, it's telling you that the creative force is beyond Richuk. On the other hand, it's a source. You're identifying clearly that this comes from a source. Like when we say, well, I don't want to use that example because it's not a creative example. I was going to say, Ein lecha esav lamata, there's no blade of grass below that does not have a mazel above that strikes it and says grow. Because there, the mazel not necessarily creates the grass, but the same idea that everything has a spiritual root. So since it's so you call it a root, you cannot say it's completely ayin mamish. And now he's going to say, so now he's going back to now the perspective from the yesh. So what then? How do we identify ayin? As loy dover. So that's what he says. V'cheinu ba'adeya the das tachten. He's now introducing das tachten. And this is how the perspective is from the perspective from below. The deya, the perception of below. The hainu das hamakabel, which means the das of the recipient, not das hamashpia. So what is it? Shahu ma'ayin liyesh. That's our perspective. That comes from ayin to yesh. Hainu, which means shamokar hu loy dover. That's what we mean by ayin. That the mokar is not made of the substance. The producing energy, the creative energy is loy dover. It's not made of the substance, ingredients, personality of the yesh. Avaloishu b'chinas ayin mamish. But we're not saying it means ayin mamish as if it's non-existent at all. It's just not of our type of existence. Dehine, now he continues, Dehine, because now, Hanivra enu yochel lahasig klal b'chinas ayin mamish. He's explaining further why we don't call it ayin mamish. In general, or more in general, not in general, sorry. A nivra is incapable of understanding at all, comprehending and fathoming ayin mamish. Because even what we're discussing now, we don't relate to the substance of ayin. It's not of our substance, but we can relate to the concept. We can understand it. People can understand that a spiritual force channels the creative energy and creates something. That's understandable, but ayin mamish is completely unfathomable to us. And what is ayin mamish? B'chinas heder ametzias. Something that completely is the lack and the antithesis of metzias. We don't relate to that. We relate, you can say it's a different type of metzias. It's a metzias ruchni. It's the letters that God uses to create everything. But ayin mamish, complete heder metzias, is not something in our capacity to understand. But now he qualifies that too. Ach im zeh, oh, actually, I don't know if he qualifies it. I think he's just going back to the other side of the coin. Ach im zeh, yet together with this, meaning simultaneously, hinezesu masig, this is understood. Shebehechlich lemer, that we're compelled to say, Shamokir hu b'chinas ayin, that the source of the yesh is from a state of ayin. Avol zeu rak ma she'ena b'chinas mitzias Kamay Metzias HaNivra. But that does not mean ayin mamish, nothingness altogether, non-existence. It means, like he says clearly now, it's not a mitzias like the mitzias of the nivra. It exists, but not like the existence of the creation or the creature. And due to this, and on this name, meaning because of this, or al shem zeh, we call this ayin. That's reason number one. As I said, almost word for word from Ayin Beis, with a few very minor changes, which I didn't point out because they're more grammatical or phraseology. The Tam HaBeis, the second reason why we, the Yesh, calls the Ayin of the Yesh, that creates the Yesh, why do we call it Ayin? The second reason. The Tam HaBeis shenikra Ayin legaba Yesh, and the second reason why it's called ayin in comparison or from the perspective of the yesh, lefisha in a musig by yesh, because it's not understood by. It's not in our parameter of comprehension. Now, just to qualify, this is not what he said a few lines before. There he was talking about that we totally can't even comprehend ayin mamish. Now he's saying that we don't understand this mysterious ayin, even though it's not ayin mamish, and it's a mitzias, but not a mitzias of the nivra, but it's still a mystery to us, or it's not comprehensible. Ki hanivroim uchrochim l'kriya shem. Frierdiker Rebbe is adding these two lines. Nivroim must have a name, a label, to identify something. Ki kol dover she'en le'shem. Any object, or any item, or any phenomenon that does not have a name, that does not have, we don't, in the chushya nevroim, in our skill set, or chushim is our senses. In our world of senses, our sensory world, we have no way to grasp it. Someone says something exists and you say, so tell me something, describe it, give it a name. Here, it doesn't mean, by the way, a name, stone, table. He means there a description. He means tell me, give me something to hold on to. So something in our existence that we cannot identify directly in our senses. I'm sorry, anything that cannot be identifiable with some label or definition, we're our sensory world, the senses of the creations or the creatures of this world are not able to grasp it. V'hainu, shashem hu habayis, abeis yad. We talked about the handle. I've used the word handle a number of times. Here he says it explicitly. Because a name, a description, a label, a definition is a beis yad. A beis yad is like the handle on a pitcher. It's a handle. Asher boy val yodei, through this handle, boy, in it, and through it, Yechelim hanivraim, the creations or the creatures are able, laches beibit fisosam, they can grasp it as they hold on to it. You need to have something to hold on to. So he's using the word beis yad, some handle. This the Frierdiker Rebbe added. The name and the handle, these three lines we just read. Uliyese bilti musig lahanivraim, next page, 113. And being that it's not comprehensible to Nivroim, because we have nothing to hold on to. We have nothing to, we can talk about it, but to comprehend it in a way that you can say, I fathom what this ayin is, no. Bilti musavrim mahu. Being that it's not comprehensible to the creations, what this is, velocis le'shem, and we're not capable of giving it a name, so what then do we call it? No. Oh, one second. Let me read a second. One second. Oh, hold on a second. How would you read the next line? I'm not sure how to read. Read from Ulosais Le'Shem. Go on, read on. Harihom Mechrachim.
You have to give him a name. ואם כן, אי אפשר לכנוסו בשום שם, רק לקרויסו בשם עין.
Okay, one second. Ulosais Le'Shem Harihom Mechrachim. Okay, I got it. Yeah, correct. This is also, I think, an addition. So since we can't, it's not musag, it's not comprehensible, I should say, to the creations, what this is, mahu, what is this? This entity called Ayin, and they need to give it a name because we need a name. Everything in this world, we need a name to identify it by. V'im kain, that's why we cannot describe it with any name, only to call it with the name Ayin. So he used the concept of a name two ways. One is everything needs a name in this world. And when it comes to this spiritual entity that creates, we don't have a name. So he says, since we don't understand it, and we need a name, so we have no other name to call it, but basically like saying Ayin, it's a unknown. It's like saying almost its name is nameless. That's also a name. We're describing it by saying it's not yesh, it's ayin. It's beyond. So the first reason is because it's not of this substance. And the second reason is because it's beyond our capacity to contain and understand. And therefore, the only name we can call it is it's like saying mystery. That's also a name. Someone will say, so what is the energy that creates existence? It's a mystery. It's another way. I'm not saying ayin means mystery, but it's like describing something by saying, I don't know what it is. The only name we can use for that is ayin. It's interesting. The Frierdiker Rebbe adds a few words here that gives it a certain additional. I'm just looking how the Rebbe Rashab. Okay, there's few extra lines add pshat to the line where he says Kiliya is bilti musig in Ayin Beis. Ef shel kanes le'shem rak l'kreise b'shem Ayin. Yeah. Okay. Val derech kriya shem man, like the name when we call man. Why was man called man? When they saw the bread come from heaven, the tam Hashem yodu mahu. So they gave it that name. Ma, what is this? It's interesting. They didn't give it a name, bread from heaven. They didn't give it any other name. They said, let's call it man, which describes mahu. What is this? So the name itself describes its exotic or its mysterious quality. Vahainu, which means shadover shabilti efshel kanese b'shum shem, an object or a phenomenon or something that you cannot describe with any name. We creations call it with the name Ayin. So Ayin is a name of something that is not understood.
We don't even call it.
Man is an excellent example. What?
We don't even call it Ma. We make a statement, Ayin.
Okay, Ayin and Ma is like the same thing, he's saying. Ma means what? And Ayin means beyond. Ayin here also means like a sense like what? Well, it's an example. In other words, we don't try to fit it into a box that we relate to. We actually give it a name that describes its other ethereal or otherworldly quality, if you wish. That's what he's saying, basically. So it's a very different meaning in Ayin than the meaning that we had earlier with from the point of view of the Yesh Amiti. Okay. V'hanivra, liyese nivra, and the creature or the creation, being that it's a creation, eina masig es ha'ayin eliki. It does not comprehend the divine energy, what we're calling ayin, the ayin eliki, this beyond state. I'll call it beyond for now. Ki ayin eliki mistater memenu. Because this ayin eliki, this divine energy that is ayin compared to the yesh, meaning ayin in the context of not understandable, is concealed from the creation. And it's explicitly due to that concealment, that it's a nivra. And here he goes now. I'll just read one more line, and he's going to go now to the point. The lulei zeis, were it not for this concealment, v'hainu, which means the ima nivra yemasigas ayin eliki. If indeed the creature and the creation would have comprehended this divine ayin, that would be the case. It would, after all, not be able to be a nivra at all. So being a nivra is predicated on the concealment. So he's explaining the reason for this. In other words, you can't have both on its own. You can't have a yesh to be a yesh nivra and it should be able to relate to and understand the ayin. If it did, it wouldn't be able to be a nivra at all. And he's going to explain this further now. And we discussed it as well in Ayin Beis. So we'll stop here. Top of page 113. You see, I'm trying to move quicker until we finish this mimer and a little more. And then we will turn to Ayin Beis. So on top of page 113, and we're talking about the relationship between the yesh and the ayin now, both sides to it. On one hand, it relates to it, it's closer, but it still remains beyond, either because it's not of the same substance, or the second reason, because it's not in our comprehension. This again doesn't mean you can't talk about it, but it's at the end of the day, if you were to say, what is the ayin in this table, you'd have to say that it's the best word you would use is ayin, not try to explain it in the same terms that we explain the table itself. Okay. So we stop here.